French writer Voltaire said, "Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities." Absurdity is the new normal, bringing atrocity that bit closer. We live in a world of the absurd, have done for years now. There must be a department of the absurd somewhere, with staff incentivised by bonuses and coming up with the most absurd notions for sale to the public. Last week it was about a citizen army to fight the Russians. Your country needs you. Welcome back to 1915 and preparations for the catastrophe of the Somme. That absurdity came hot on the heels of our Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, unelected and unwanted but empowered to make decisions on our behalf, an absurdity in itself, pledging British support for Ukraine for 100 years or more, meaning your taxes, your children's, your grandchildren's. And has anyone asked the Ukrainian people if they're even up for 100 years war? It's been going on for so long now, the absurdity, it's getting hard to remember that the world wasn't always this way. COVID changed everything. The green light for the rollout of all the absurdity in the world. Stockpiled absurdity was pushed like knock-off watches and handbags out the backs of lorries. Healthy people shut in their homes. People arrested for walking alone in the mountains or running along beaches. Heaven forbid they might stay fit and boost their vitamin D. Elderly people on end-of-life care, midazolam and morphine, instead of getting treatment for illness. Gyms closed, but fast food outlets open round the clock, the better to replace muscle with fat. Illness instead of health. Chains on swings in play parks, hazard tape on park benches, magic arrows on the floors of supermarkets. Fear stoked that COVID couldn't get you if you were sat down in a restaurant, but that it might kill you if you walked to the toilet without a strip of blue paper over your mouth and nose. Scientists have sown more fear porn by claiming COVID is the new HIV. And who was up to his elbows in experiments concerning both? Oh yes, Anthony Fauci, former boss of the US Centre for Disease Control. Nothing to see here. Now the leader of Slovakia, Robert Fico, has vowed to investigate what happened to his people in that time of the biggest financial deal in European Commission history, being the order for vast quantities of the so-called vaccines, and to ask why so many people were urged to take products of unproven efficacy. Here at home, our own COVID inquiry won't even consider the matter of the so-called vaccines until after the next election, if ever. And then the absurdity of said PM Sunak standing up in Parliament last week to declare unequivocally that COVID vaccines are safe. More and more the absurdity is obvious, like the grin on the Cheshire cat that won't go away. In Canada, a federal judge ruled last week that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's use of the Emergencies Act to crush the Freedom Convoy protests by the country's truckers was unreasonable and violated charter rights. Undaunted and unashamed, Trudeau's government is appealing the decision. Canadian author Regina Watteau has published a new book, Fissman's Fraud, detailing the crime committed against the Canadian people when what she calls hate science, exploiting imaginary data and excluding real-world data, was used to invert reality and to demonise and destroy those who chose not to receive the experimental gene therapies. She details how mainstream media and academic institutions conspired to make impossible the lives of those disinclined to risk the shots, and so emboldened the Canadian government to freeze the bank accounts of those taking part in or supporting the truckers' protests, even to throw them in jail. The truth is out there, and yet those responsible remain in place, moving on to the next absurdity.
How to swiftly emerge from a rapidly sinking car in just a matter of seconds. A fatal construction flaw in all...
It won't be long before the guilty exonerate themselves of all blame by declaring none of it actually happened. I kid you not. Canada is the country in which a real-life Nazi was, just last year, treated to a standing ovation in that country's parliament, applauded by Justin Trudeau and the rest of the parliamentarians for his efforts to fight the Russians, our allies, without whom Nazism would have conquered the world. Beyond absurd, utterly shameful, and yet consequences for Trudeau were there none. Around the jabbed countries of the world, excess deaths are, to put it mildly, alarming to anyone with their eyes open, that is. Others injured by the injectables are ignored, ridiculed, living lives in limbo after having been persuaded they were doing the right thing or downright coerced on pain of losing jobs. Government statistics here in Britain, in the United States, across Europe, in Asia, show people of all ages dying unexpectedly in large numbers. Heart attacks are up by 20% in the middle-aged. Fatal heart attacks in people not previously known to have been suffering ill health. Excess deaths for the young are higher too. Mortuaries are overflowing, making room for extra corpses, funeral directors struggling to cope. And yet, despite the efforts of lone voices like that of Andrew Bridgen MP, doggedly asking questions about causes and seeking compassionate debate by his parliamentary colleagues, all but a handful steadfastly refuses to talk about why thousands of their constituents are dropping dead and not of COVID. Is that behaviour by so many elected representatives just absurd? Or are we witnessing a silent, unquestioned atrocity? Those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities, remember. I say absurdity came close to atrocity in the COVID era. Peaceful protesters in Western countries all over the world were beaten by police armed with riot gear and pepper spray. Young women pinned against walls, throttled by policemen. Here in Britain, mainstream media figures made space for speculating about whether those refusing the injectables ought to be held down in the street and forcibly jabbed, or driven from society as though their very existence was a threat. Absurdity is all around. No functioning border on Britain's southern coastline, no functioning southern border in the United States. Veteran soldiers and other homeless cold on our streets while migrants are paid to stay in hotels and handed free mobile phones. Someone said this week, if they can make you believe men can have babies, they've got you. In this world of the absurd, we're told men can be women and women can be men. We're not just told this, we're threatened that if we don't endorse the absurdity, we're hateful people liable for prosecution. Laws are being rewritten to erase the existence of women as an immutable, biological fact, so that being a woman is nothing more than a choice available to any and all. Is this just absurd, or is it atrocious? I say what is atrocious is the hoax that is the so-called climate crisis. Billions of pounds and dollars being made by those in control of the propaganda, while billions of people are ushered ever closer to the abyss. There are nearly 8 billion of us alive now, and an estimated 4 billion depend on food grown with nitrogen fertilisers. Without those fertilisers, without that food, those billions will likely die of man-made starvation, and yet claims have been made that gas resultant from those fertilisers is bringing planet Earth to boiling point. Nothing less than war, attritional war, is being waged on the farmers of the world by authoritarian governments. But in response to that grotesque absurdity, those farmers and more of the people of the world are standing up and fighting back for the sake of all. Standing by while millions are denied food would be an atrocity, and yet by accepting the nonsense of net zero, the global suicide note written on our behalf by transnational entities like the World Health Organization, the World Economic Forum and the United Nations, the claptrap trotted out annually at COP and Davos by corporations like BlackRock, we're doing little more than cheering the arrival of the horsemen of the apocalypse. CO2, plant food for a greener world, is demonised as poison. This too is absurd. Those in pursuit of control of information, control of the mainstream already achieved, and control of the internet next up, have coined a new term for information they simply don't like. This is so-called malinformation, information which is openly and frankly acknowledged as truth, as fact, but truthful facts that get in the way of the powerful having their way. To paraphrase multimillionaire climate hoaxer and sometime US presidential candidate Al Gore, malinformation is inconvenient truth. During the run-up to the 2020 US election, the contents of Hunter Biden's laptop were deemed malinformation by those backing his dad. And though that laptop was real and those damning contents were real, their existence was whitewashed until Biden Sr. was in the White House. Talk about influencing an election. Allegations that Donald Trump colluded with Russia in return for power have been exposed as downright lies, and yet such claims are levelled at the most popular politician in the United States to this day. Former Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi says those protesting the war in Gaza are doing Putin's bidding. We're told that unless we are ready to go to war with Russia, Putin will push ever westwards. War is the ultimate atrocity, leading to slaughter, and yet war is the goal of the governments of the West. War in Ukraine, in the Middle East, the dream of war with Russia, with Iran, with China. driven as they are by the appetites and wants of those transnational corporations that make all their decisions for them. All the way back in 1915, during the war that was supposed to end all wars, what an absurd notion that was, another philosopher, Georg Gurdjieff, said, "In times of madness, such as wars, men suddenly seem to lose even the small amount of common sense they had and turn into complete automatons, giving themselves over to wholesale destruction in vast numbers, even losing the instinct of self-preservation. There are periods in the life of humanity which generally coincide with the fall of cultures and civilization, when the masses irretrievably lose their reason and begin to destroy everything that has been created by the centuries and millenniums of culture." Here's the thing. Today, it is not the many who would knowingly destroy everything, but the few, prepared as they are to wreck our world rather than surrender an iota of their power and wealth. They would commit all manner of atrocities in our name. But the masses are increasingly aware of the absurdity and of the imminence of atrocity. The great awakening from the nightmare is all around us. I predict the next global pandemic will be made not of some confected disease, but of an overwhelming, enlightening wave of sanity and truth.
This simple yet brilliant trick to heat your home in 90 seconds will save thousands of pounds on your